The first time Peter Sutton heard her name, he was 3 fingers deep into a bottle of rye whiskey and not particularly interested in hearing anything at all. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, was the kind of place that ate men whole and spat out their bones without so much as a pause for digestion. Situated just north of the Cherokee Strip, Caldwell sat at the crossroads of cattle trails and human ambition, a town perpetually coated in dust and the particular smell of cattle, horse sweat, and sun-baked earth. It was not a gentle place. It did not pretend to be. The men who lived there had learned not to expect gentleness from anything, and most of them had long since stopped looking for it. Peter Sutton was 32 years old, and he had the face of a man who had seen enough to know that hope was a luxury best left to younger, less informed souls. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, built by years of ranch work and trail riding, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes the color of a Kansas sky in October, that particular shade of gray-blue that could not quite decide between storm and calm. He wore his clothes the way most working cowboys wore theirs: practical, well-worn, chosen for function rather than appearance. His hat was a wide-brimmed brown felt that had survived 3 Kansas summers and 1 particularly vicious hailstorm. The brim on the left side had been dented inward and never fully recovered, and he had stopped trying to fix it. He worked for the Hargrove Ranch, which sat about 6 miles east of Caldwell proper, running cattle up from Texas every season and holding them on the grass until the buyers came from the railhead. It was good work in the way that all hard work is good. It kept a man tired enough to sleep and busy enough to think about something other than the particular loneliness that comes from living most of one's life in the saddle, with only the conversation of cattle and open sky for company. Peter did not have much to say, as a rule. He never had. Even as a boy growing up in Missouri, he had been the quiet one, the one who sat at the edge of things and watched while others talked and laughed and filled up the air with noise. His mother had called it thoughtful. His father had called it sullen. Neither of them had been entirely right or wrong about it, and Peter had eventually stopped trying to explain himself at all. He had been engaged once, 7 years back, to a woman named Clara who had pretty brown eyes and talked enough for both of them, which had seemed like a reasonable arrangement at the time. Clara had liked to fill every silence with words, tumbling them out in long, bright streams like she was afraid of what might live in the quiet places. Peter had found it comforting for a while, then merely pleasant, then slowly exhausting in the way that too much of any one thing becomes exhausting. Clara had eventually married a shopkeeper in Wichita who laughed at her jokes and never ran out of things to say back to her, and Peter had wished her well without quite knowing if he felt heartbroken or relieved. He had ridden south from Wichita 2 days after the wedding announcement, taken a job with a cattle outfit near Dodge City, and decided somewhere along the red Kansas highways that he was simply not made for the particular architecture of love. It was not self-pity that brought him to this conclusion. It was something closer to honest assessment. He was a quiet man in a loud world, and every woman he had met in the intervening years had eventually grown impatient with his silences, had poked and prodded at them trying to find out what was hiding inside, and had eventually concluded, sometimes gently, sometimes not, that a man with nothing to say was a man with nothing to offer. He had decided, somewhere around the age of 30, that they were probably right. So he worked. He worked long days and longer seasons, and he sat on the Hargrove porch in the evening smoking the occasional cigarette and looking out at the flat grass rolling away to the horizon, and he told himself that this was enough. The land was enough. The work was enough. The particular beauty of a Kansas sunset bleeding red and gold across 40 miles of unbroken sky was enough, and he did not need more than that. He mostly believed it. That was where things stood on the April evening when Hector Lamb, the Hargrove Ranch's foreman, came into the Silver Rail Saloon in Caldwell where Peter was nursing his whiskey, and said, without preamble, New schoolteacher arrived on the afternoon stage. Hargrove's wife is throwing a welcome supper at the church on Friday, and she expects every man on the payroll to be there, cleaned up and presentable. Peter turned the glass slowly in his hands. I'm not much of a supper person. Nobody asked what you're much of, Hector said, dropping into the chair across from him. Hector was 53 years old, lean as a fence rail, with a white mustache that drooped impressively at both ends and eyes that had seen 3 wars and more cattle drives than he could count. He and Peter had worked together for 4 years and understood each other in the wordless way that men of similar temperament sometimes manage. Mrs. Hargrove organized the whole thing. She's particularly keen because this schoolteacher apparently came a long way on her own, and she thinks the woman deserves a proper welcome. Where'd she come from? Ohio, they're saying, place called Marietta. Came out on her own looking for work after Hector paused, seemed to weigh something, then finished. Well, after some kind of trouble back home. Nobody's asked too many questions about it. Peter nodded slowly and said nothing, which was his way of indicating that he had absorbed the information and would think about it on his own time. He went to the supper on Friday because Mrs. Hargrove was a formidable woman and her expectations had the weight of natural law about them. He put on his cleanest shirt, which was dark blue cotton, and combed his hair back, and rode into town in the flat gold light of a late spring afternoon with about as much enthusiasm as a man riding to have a tooth pulled. The church social hall smelled of beeswax candles and roasted chicken, and the particular sweet starchy smell of fresh cornbread, and it was crowded with most of Caldwell's respectable population, standing around in their best clothes making the particular kind of cheerful noise that people make when they are performing sociability for a guest. Peter got himself a plate and found a place along the wall where he could eat without being required to talk, and he was doing perfectly well at this when Mrs. Hargrove appeared at his elbow like she had been conjured. Peter Sutton, she said, stop hiding against the wall and come meet the new teacher. She's been standing near the punch bowl looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, and I think you two might have that in common. Peter looked across the room toward the punch bowl. She was standing slightly apart from the nearest cluster of women, holding a cup in both hands and looking toward the window rather than the room. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up in a practical way that suggested she had done it herself without much fuss. She was not the kind of woman who would have stopped a man in his tracks in a crowded room. She was not striking in any obvious, immediate way. But there was something about the stillness of her that caught the eye precisely, because everything else in the room was moving and loud. She stood the way still water stands, quiet, composed, containing depths that the surface gave no particular indication of. Her name, as Peter would learn in the course of the obligatory introduction, Mrs. Hargrove, engineered with all the subtlety of a cattle drive, was Mabel Baker. She shook his hand firmly, which he appreciated, and said, Mr. Sutton, with a nod that acknowledged his existence without demanding anything more of it. Miss Baker, he said back, and they stood in silence for a moment while Mrs. Hargrove chattered about the school and the children and the community, and Peter noticed that Mabel Baker did not fill the silence between him and herself with unnecessary words. She listened to Mrs. Hargrove with her full attention and responded when responses were called for, but she did not, as many people did when confronted with a quiet stranger, feel the apparent need to fill every gap with sound. He found himself curious about her, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. He did not pursue it. He finished his supper, said his polite goodbyes, and rode back to the Hargrove ranch in the spring dark, listening to the coyotes calling across the grass and thinking about nothing in particular. The next time he saw Mabel Baker was 3 weeks later, and it was not at a social occasion. The Caldwell schoolhouse sat at the east end of town, a modest frame building with a bell tower that had never had a bell and a patch of dusty yard in front that doubled as a play area when school was in session. It was not much to look at. The previous teacher, an older man named Dobbins who had lasted 2 years before the isolation drove him back to civilization, had left the place in a state of benign neglect. Cracked window pane on the south side, a door that didn't quite latch, a stovepipe that needed cleaning, and a front step that had rotted through enough to be genuinely dangerous. Mrs. Hargrove, who sat on the town school board in her own particular implacable fashion, had asked Peter to ride out and take a look at what repairs needed doing, since she knew he was handy with tools and the school had no budget for a proper carpenter. He rode out on a Saturday morning with a box of tools tied behind his saddle and a plank of lumber he'd cut at the ranch, and he found Mabel Baker on her hands and knees in the yard pulling weeds from around the building's foundation with the focused intensity of someone who had decided this particular patch of ground was going to be respectable if it was the last thing she accomplished. She looked up when he rode in. "Mr. Sutton." "Miss Baker." He dismounted and tied his horse to the post. "Mrs. Hargrove sent me to look at the repairs." "The step is the worst of it," she said, standing and brushing her hands on her apron. "And there's a window with a crack that lets in the wind." "I'll start with the step." She nodded and went back to her weeding. He worked on the front step, pulling up the rotted boards and fitting the new plank, and she moved around the yard doing whatever she had decided needed doing, and neither of them said very much at all. He noticed, and was aware that he was noticing, which was itself unusual, that the silence between them was easy. It was not the strained quiet of two people who could not think of anything to say. It was the practical quiet of two people engaged in separate work who did not feel the need to narrate the experience. He had encountered that kind of silence before, mostly with other men who worked with their hands, but he could not remember encountering it with a woman. He fixed the step, then the window, then climbed up and cleared the stovepipe with a chimney brush he'd brought along on the off chance it needed it. By the time he came down, the sun was high and hot, and Mabel had gone inside and come back with a tin cup of water from the school's pump, which she held out to him without comment. He drank it. "Thank you. Thank you for the repairs," she said. "The children would have gone through that step inside of a week, probably." They stood in the yard in the midday light and looked at the building, and Peter had the peculiar sensation of being completely comfortable in a situation that by all the conventions of social life should have required more words. "Where'd you learn to do that?" she asked eventually, nodding at the stovepipe. "The chimney work, I mean." "My father had a stove in Missouri that needed cleaning every season," he said. "He made sure I learned how to do it before I left home." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, and did not ask follow-up questions about his father or Missouri or the rest of his history. He found this restraint remarkable. Most people, when given one personal detail, immediately deployed it as a doorway to extract more. "You're from Ohio," he said, which was the extent of what he knew. "Marietta," she confirmed. "Southeast corner on the river. Long way to come." "Yes," she said simply, and there was something in the single syllable that was finished and complete, that closed the topic without slamming it, and he respected that closure enough to leave it alone. He rode back to the ranch with the distinct and somewhat alarming feeling that he would like to see Mabel Baker again. He thought about this for several days, turning it over like a stone in his hand, examining it from different angles. It was not that she was particularly beautiful, though she was handsome in an angular, clear-eyed way that grew on a person. It was not that she had charmed him with wit or warmth, though she had been perfectly pleasant. It was something more specific and harder to name, the ease of it, the absence of pressure, the feeling that he could exist in her vicinity without having to explain or justify or perform himself for her benefit. He thought about going to the schoolhouse again on some pretext or other. He told himself this was foolish. He told himself he had made his peace with solitude and that peace had served him well. He told himself that women were complicated and that his track record in that particular territory was not encouraging. And then, on a Wednesday evening in late May, He rode into Caldwell for supplies and found Mabel Baker sitting alone on the bench outside the general store with a book open in her lap, and she looked up from the book as he tied his horse, and she said, "Good evening, Mr. Sutton," and he said, "Good evening, Miss Baker." And then somehow he was sitting on the bench beside her, though he could not have fully explained how that had happened. She went back to her book and he sat there and watched the street, and they were quiet together in the long gold light of a Kansas evening, and it was the most comfortable he had felt in anyone's company in a very long time. He came back the next Wednesday, and the one after that. It became a habit without either of them explicitly making it one. He would arrive in town on Wednesday evenings for his supplies, and she would be outside the general store or the library when it had one, or sometimes just walking along the street, and they would fall into step or settle somewhere together and be quiet in the same space. And sometimes they would talk and sometimes they would not, and both states were entirely fine. He learned things about her in fragments, the way you learn about a landscape, not all at once, but in accumulations, each visit adding something small to the whole picture. She had grown up in a house full of noise, she said once, with 4 brothers all older and larger and louder than herself. She had learned to read because books were quieter than brothers, and the space inside a book was hers alone. She had wanted to be a teacher since she was 12 years old and had practiced on the neighborhood children in Marietta until she was old enough to actually attend the normal school in Columbus. She did not tell him in those early weeks what had brought her to Kansas specifically. He did not ask. He had recognized in her the same instinct he had in himself, the preference for sharing things in one's own time, and not because someone else was applying pressure to the envelope. He trusted her to tell him what she wanted him to know when she was ready to know it herself. She learned things about him in the same way. That he had grown up in Missouri. That his parents had both died of fever when he was 19, and he had gone west because there was nothing particularly holding him east. That he had been a cowboy on the trail drives for 4 years, before taking up permanent work at the Hargrove Ranch. That he was not a man who needed a great deal of conversation to feel connected to a place or a person, which she received with a slight nod and the particular quality of attention that meant she was filing it away. By July, they were friends. It was genuine and clear and without ambiguity, and Peter told himself that this was good and sufficient, and that he was not going to complicate it by wanting more. He was not particularly convincing to himself. The thing that changed the nature of his self-deception happened in the first week of July, on a Tuesday evening that was not one of their regular Wednesday meetings. He had ridden into town to pick up a part for the windmill that had come in on the supply wagon, and he was cutting back through the edge of town when he heard raised voices from the direction of the school. There were 3 men standing in the schoolyard, and even from a distance, Peter could see by the set of them that the conversation was not friendly. 2 of the men he recognized as brothers Rafe and Dutch Connor, who ran a small spread north of town and had a reputation for being difficult when they had been drinking, which was more often than not. The 3rd man he did not know. They were blocking the path to the schoolhouse door, and Mabel Baker was standing on the step with her arms crossed and her chin up, her expression entirely composed and entirely immovable, like a small mountain that had been standing in exactly that spot for several thousand years, and did not intend to move for 3 men who smelled of whiskey. The argument, as Peter could hear it when he rode into the yard, was about the Connor boy's sister, a girl of about 14 named Della who had apparently, in the course of her education, begun to form opinions about things that her brothers found inconvenient. Specifically, she had told Rafe Connor at the supper table that she intended to continue her schooling past the age of 14, and Rafe had decided this was the teacher's fault and had come to say so. "She's got no business filling that girl's head with ideas about," Rafe was saying when Peter pulled up and dismounted. "About what?" Mabel said. Her voice was level and quiet and entirely without fear. "About her own future, about her own mind. About things that ain't her concern," Rafe said. He was a thick man, not tall but wide, with a red face and narrow eyes that were currently narrower than usual. You teach her her letters and her arithmetic, and that's the end of it. You don't teach her to talk back to her family. I teach my students to think, Mabel said. What they do with that is their own business. And yours, Mr. Connor, which is exactly why you're here and not in my classroom. Peter came to stand slightly behind and to the left of the men, not threateningly but as a presence, and he said, "Evening, Rafe." Dutch, with the particular flat evenness that communicated without dramatics that there would be no escalation of this situation tonight. Rafe turned and looked at him. Peter looked back, steady and unhurried, and said nothing else. There was a long moment, the kind of moment that measures itself in heartbeats rather than seconds. Then Dutch said, "Come on, Rafe, let's get on." And after one more long look at Mabel that communicated nothing good and nothing final, Rafe turned and the three of them left. Peter watched them go, then turned back to Mabel. She was still standing on the step, still composed, though he thought he could see, if he was reading her right, which he was increasingly confident he was, a very small tremor in her hands before she folded them together in front of her. "Thank you," she said. "You were handling it fine on your own." The corner of her mouth moved. "I know that, but I'm glad you came anyway." He stood in her schoolyard as the summer evening went gold around them, and he thought for the first time with something like decision rather than mere acknowledgement that he was in serious trouble where this woman was concerned. He did not say any of this. He said, "I'll check the latch on that door before I go, make sure it locks properly." "It locks fine," she said. "I'll check it anyway." He checked the latch and she went inside to close the windows. And when she came back out he was still there, not quite ready to leave. And she did not seem particularly ready for him to leave either. So they ended up sitting on the front step, the same front step he had repaired in May, solid now and reliable, and watching the light leave the sky until it was just a deep blue that faded to purple that faded to the first stars. "They'll be back," she said. "Men like that always come back." "Maybe," Peter said, "but Rafe Connor's basically a sensible man when he's sober. I'll talk to him." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." There was a pause. The coyotes were starting up somewhere out on the flat grass. "Why are you kind to me, Mr. Sutton?" she asked. It was not a coy question. It was a genuine one, direct and curious. He thought about it. "I don't know that it's kindness specifically," he said. "I think it might just be that you're easy to be around." She was quiet for a moment. "Nobody has ever said that to me before," she said, and the way she said it, the slight fractured quality underneath the steadiness, told him that it meant something significant. He did not ask her to elaborate. She did not elaborate. They sat in the dark, and the coyotes sang their wild, lonely songs out on the grass, and it felt like something had shifted between them slightly, like a door easing open on an unused hinge. He rode back to the ranch in the full dark with a feeling he had not felt in a very long time, and had almost stopped believing was real, the feeling of being pulled towards something rather than merely pushed through the days by the machinery of work and habit. He talked to Rafe Connor on Thursday, catching him sober at the feed store. The conversation was brief and unpleasant and effective. Rafe was sullen about it but not stupid. He knew Peter Sutton well enough to know that the quiet ones were the ones worth listening to, and he agreed not to go back to the schoolhouse making trouble. He did not agree with anything else, but that was fine. Peter had not asked him to change his opinions, only his actions. Mabel heard about the conversation secondhand and thanked Peter the following Wednesday by bringing him a slice of apple pie wrapped in cloth, which she handed to him without making a production of it. He ate it on the bench outside the general store while she read her book and the evening came in around them, and he thought that this, exactly this, the ordinary miraculous this, was what he had been missing without quite knowing how to name it. He asked her to walk with him the following Sunday. Not to dinner, not to any formal occasion, just to walk out along the creek south of town where the cottonwoods grew tall and the grass was long and green in the shade. She said yes in the same practical way. She agreed to most things. as though it was a reasonable idea that she had already considered and approved of. They walked for 2 hours along the creek, talking sometimes and quiet other times in the comfortable way they had developed. She told him that she was considering teaching the older girls a separate lesson 2 afternoons a week in practical mathematics. Not just arithmetic, but the kind of figuring that a woman needed to manage a household or understand a contract. Things that were not typically part of the standard curriculum, but that she felt were genuinely necessary. She said this with the expectant air of someone who had expressed this opinion before and been met with resistance. "That seems sensible to me," Peter said. She looked at him sideways. "Most people don't agree." "Most people haven't thought about it the way you have," he said. "A woman who can't read a land deed or manage accounts is a woman who's dependent on somebody else's honesty for her survival. That seems like a disadvantage worth correcting." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to find her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, something between surprise and recognition, like seeing a familiar face in an unexpected place. "You think about these things," she said. "I think about most things," he said. "I just don't usually talk about it." "Why not?" He considered the honest answer. "Most people don't actually want to hear a person's real thoughts," he said. "They want to hear agreement or argument, but the space between those things," he paused, trying to find the shape of what he meant. "Most conversations aren't really about thinking. They're about positioning." She looked at him for another moment, and then she began walking again, and he fell into step beside her, and she said, "Yes, that is exactly it. That is exactly why I have always found most conversation exhausting." They walked for another half-mile without speaking, and it felt like an arrival at something. He brought her wildflowers the next time they walked. He had not planned to, he had simply noticed them growing along the trail, a cluster of prairie phlox in pale purple, and he had pulled them without thinking about it and handed them to her when they met. She took them and held them and said, "Thank you," and did not make a production of it, which was exactly right. The trouble with the Connor boys, as Peter had predicted, did not entirely resolve itself with his conversation. Rafe stayed away from the school, but Dutch had a friend named Holt who was a different kind of trouble entirely. The kind that did not respond to reasonable conversation and had a long memory for what it considered slights. Holt had decided, for reasons that were mostly about his own grievances against the town's respectable element, that the new schoolteacher was a symbol of something he resented, and he made his resentment felt in small, vicious ways. The broken window at the school that appeared one morning with no explanation, the knocked-over privy at the back of the schoolyard, the slanderous rumor about Mabel's character that circulated through the rougher end of town for about 2 weeks in August. Peter heard the rumor. He did not tell Mabel about it, she would hear it soon enough from someone less careful, but he tracked down its source, which was Holt making noise in the silver rail, and he told Holt, quietly and completely, that the rumor needed to stop and precisely what the consequences would be if it did not. Holt looked at him with contempt. Peter looked back without blinking. The rumor stopped. He told Mabel about it afterward, which was harder in some ways than confronting Holt, because telling her meant saying that people had thought and said unkind things about her, and he did not like being the one to carry that news. She received it with the same composure she received most things, which he had come to understand did not mean she was unaffected but that she had chosen not to perform her feelings for an audience. Her hands went flat on the table where they were sitting, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I knew there was something going around. I could tell by the way Mrs. Wheeler looked at me last week." "It's done now," he said. "Thank you for stopping it." A pause. "Was it difficult?" "No," he said. She nodded, then after a moment, "Why do you do these things for me?" He was quiet for a beat. "Same reason I fixed your step, I suppose. Because Mrs. Hargrove asked you to." He met her eyes. "No, not that reason." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze and did not look away, and something passed between them that was past the need for words. Her eyes were dark gray in the lamplight, direct and clear, and he thought that he had never in his life looked into a person's eyes and felt understood the way he did right now, without either of them having said exactly the right thing. She looked down at her hands on the table, a long exhale. "I left Ohio," she said, and he understood that she was choosing right now to tell him the thing she had not told him yet, "because I was engaged to a man who turned out to be the kind of man who used his hands for things they should not be used for. I left in March of last year and I did not look back." The table was very quiet. The lamp made a small sound. "I'm glad you left," Peter said. "I was afraid," she said, "for a long time after." "I did not trust," she stopped, rearranged whatever she was going to say. "I was not sure I trusted my own judgment anymore, about people." "Your judgment seems fine to me," he said. "I thought so too," she said slowly, as though testing the words as she spoke them, "until I kept testing it and finding it mostly reliable." She looked up at him again. "You, for instance. What about me?" "From the very first evening," she said, "at Mrs. Hargrove's supper, I thought this is a man I do not need to be afraid of." He did not say anything to that because there was nothing adequate to say, and she seemed to understand that his silence was not absence but the fullest presence he had to offer. They walked home from wherever they were as the stars came out over the Kansas plain, and when they said good evening at the corner where their paths diverged, he held her hand for a moment longer than he needed to, and she let him, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to let go. August arrived with its full weight of heat and dust, and the particular relentless brightness of the Kansas summer, and the cattle drives were running heavy, and Peter was working long days that left him little time for anything beyond work and the minimum necessary sleep. He missed the Wednesday evenings with a sharpness that surprised him. He had grown so accustomed to the rhythm of them that their absence had a texture he could feel. He wrote to her. One letter, not long in his careful print, because he had never practiced cursive enough to trust it. He told her he was sorry to miss the last 2 Wednesdays and hoped she was well, and that the school was ready for the fall term that was starting soon. He told her he had seen a pair of sandhill cranes on the creek near the ranch that week, and thought she might like to know about them, since she had mentioned once that she kept a list of birds she had observed, and the crane was not common this far west. He folded the letter and sent it into town with a rider going in for supplies. She wrote back within 2 days. Her hand was clear and elegant, and she told him the school was ready and the children had started arriving, and the Delaconner girl was showing a genuine talent for mathematics that Mabel fully intended to cultivate. She told him that she had added the sandhill cranes to her list and marked them with an asterisk for exceptional circumstance of sighting, as she did with all unusual observations. She told him she hoped the cattle work was going well and that the grass was good, because she had heard the ranchers worrying about dry spells, and she had started paying attention to things like that since coming to Kansas, because the land here demanded to be paid attention to in ways that Ohio land did not. He read the letter 3 times and folded it into his shirt pocket, where it spent 3 days before he thought to put it somewhere more permanent. He had a box under his bunk, old pine with a brass clasp, where he kept the few things that mattered to him. A photograph of his parents taken when he was 10 years old, a silver dollar his father had given him when he left home, a pocket-sized copy of a poetry collection he had carried since his early 20s and read on trail nights when the stars were out and the cattle were quiet. He put Mabel's letter in the box. He was back in town on the 2nd Wednesday of September, and she was waiting on the bench outside the store, not quite as if she had been counting the days, but with a quality of composed expectation that told him she had been looking forward to this. He sat down beside her, and for the first moment they were both simply quiet, not the quiet of people with nothing to say, but the particular quiet of reunion, of 2 people settling back into the ease of each other after an absence. The evening was cooler now, the summer's back finally broken, and the main street of Caldwell was busy with the end-of-season activity of a cattle town preparing for winter. "The cranes," she said eventually. "Did you actually see them yourself or just trust my report?" "I trusted your report," she said, And then I looked. There were two down by the creek south of Mulberry Road. They were there 2 mornings in a row and then they weren't. They're heading south, he said. Same as everything sensible this time of year. I'm not going south, she said, and there was something light in it, almost playful, which was relatively new territory between them and felt like sunlight after fog. No, he said. I noticed that. She looked at him with one eyebrow very slightly raised, the corners of her mouth held in careful restraint. He looked back and felt the absurdity of whatever elaborate carefulness he had been operating under for the past months and said, Mabel. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She knew what it meant. Peter, she said back, equally quiet, equally weighted. There was nothing dramatic about it. The street went on being busy. A dog trotted past with purposeful air. 2 horses stamped at the hitching rail. The whole enormous ordinary world went about its business, and on this bench in the last light of a September evening, something that had been building since April arrived quietly at its destination. He did not kiss her then. It was not the right moment, and she would not have wanted it to be that sudden. But he did take her hand, and she turned her hand in his and held it back, and they sat like that as the light failed and the first stars came up, and the coyotes began their evening commentary on the state of the world. He called at the schoolhouse on Sunday with 2 horses, and asked if she would like to ride out east along the ridge, where he knew from experience that the September light on the autumn grass was something worth seeing. She came out in a dark green riding skirt that he had not seen before and put her foot in the stirrup, and swung up with the efficiency of someone who had been on a horse before, and was not pretending otherwise, which was one more thing to add to his growing accounting of her. They rode out east, and the land opened up around them the way it does when you get away from town, vast and golden, and utterly indifferent to human concern in the most beautiful possible way. The grass was long and moving in the September wind, silver and amber and deep gold, and the sky was that particular October-approaching shade of blue that Peter had always thought was the finest sky in the world. "Oh," she said softly, stopping her horse on the ridge and looking out. Just that. Just the one word and then nothing, taking it in. He stopped beside her and was quiet with her, and let the land be what it was, and did not narrate it or explain it or feel the need to say anything about it at all. They sat their horses side by side at the top of the ridge, and the wind moved through the grass, and the sky went on forever in every direction, and it was entirely, perfectly sufficient. After a long time she said, "I understand why you love this. I've never told you I love it. I can tell," she said simply. He looked at her profile against the enormous sky, the clear line of her nose and jaw, the hair coming loose at her temple in the wind, the way she held herself in the saddle with the same composed straightness she held herself everywhere. He thought about the word love, how it had always seemed to him like an announcement people made rather than a thing they actually lived, how he had always mistrusted it in proportion to how loudly it was declared. He did not say the word. He was not ready yet, and she was not asking him to be. But he felt it solid and quiet and entirely unlike the uncertain, effortful thing it had always seemed to be in his experience, and he thought that maybe he had been wrong about himself, not unmade for this after all, only waiting for the particular version of it that did not require him to be someone he wasn't. In October, there was a complication. A man arrived in Caldwell on the Tuesday stage from Wichita, and Peter heard about him before he saw him, a traveling man, a land speculator of some kind from back east, polished in the way that men with money and no particular land connection are polished. His name was Garrett, and within 2 days of his arrival he had made inquiries at the school, which was unusual enough to be noticed. Peter heard about it from Hector, who had heard it from the banker's wife, who had heard it directly. Garrett had presented himself at the school on Wednesday afternoon when the children were dismissed, and had spoken to Mabel for about 15 minutes and then left, and nobody knew exactly what had been said. Peter did not ask Mabel about it immediately, because it was not his business, and he was not going to make it his business by demanding information she had not chosen to give. But on the following Wednesday evening, she told him herself. "I need to tell you about the man who came to see me last week," she said. She had not sat down beside him in the usual way. She was standing slightly in front of the bench, facing him with her arms folded in the way she folded them when she was preparing to say something that required care. "All right," he said. "His name is Garrett. He is my brother-in-law." A pause. "Or was. He is the brother of the man I was engaged to in Ohio. He came to tell me that Edmund, that was his name, that Edmund died in January. A riding accident." She held his gaze steadily. "He came to tell me because he thought I deserved to know. He is not like his brother. He is a decent man." Peter was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he asked. She considered. "Relieved," she said honestly, and then ashamed of being relieved, and then she paused. "And then I thought about what I am now in terms of what I was carrying, and I think I put it down, the last of it, the fear that he might follow me here." "Was that a real fear?" "It was," she said, "for a long time." He stood up from the bench. She did not step back. He was close to her now, close enough that he could see the particular steadiness in her eyes, the quality of a woman who had been through things and had not been made smaller by them, but something harder to describe, made more fully herself. "You're not afraid now," he said. "No," she said. "Not now." He reached up and touched her face very gently, the side of her cheek, and she leaned into his hand the smallest fraction, like a plant turning toward the particular light it needs, and it was the most significant thing he had ever felt. He kissed her then, on the bench outside the general store in the full view of any of Caldwell's citizens who happened to be looking, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything fully and without apology. When they separated, she looked at him with her composed expression that he could now read the way you read a landscape you have walked many times, and she said, "I was wondering when that was going to happen." "I was trying not to rush you," he said. "I noticed," she said. "It was considerate of you." A pause, possibly slightly overextended but considerate. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you by arriving when you had forgotten it was possible. And she smiled at him with her whole face for the first time, not the small controlled smile she usually offered, but the full version, which transformed her entirely, and which he resolved to earn as often as possible for the rest of his life. The rest of October passed in a kind of golden haze that Peter would remember for years as the happiest he had been in his adult life. They saw each other when they could, which, given the demands of the fall cattle work and the demands of the school term, was not every day, but was enough Sunday rides, Wednesday evenings, the occasional supper at the Hargrove Ranch, where Mrs. Hargrove watched them with the satisfied expression of a woman who had foreseen the whole thing and was too polite to say so. He told her he loved her on a November evening when the first cold had come down from the north, and they were sitting on the bench that had become, through repetition, their bench, and she was wearing her gray wool coat, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. He had not planned it. He had been looking at her hands wrapped around the tin cup of coffee she had brought from the school and thinking about the box under his bunk and the letter in it, and the words had simply arrived. "I love you, Mabel." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright and direct and warm with something he recognized as certainty. "I love you too, Peter," she said. "I have for a while." "How long?" "Since the morning you fixed my step," she said, "and did not talk to me while you did it." He looked at her. "You were the first person in a very long time," she said, "who was simply present with me without needing me to perform something for them. Who was quiet without making the quiet into a problem." She paused. "I did not know I needed that until I had it." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the cold November evening with the stars coming out hard and bright above the Kansas plain, and he thought about all the years he had spent being his quiet self in a world that did not have much use for it, all the times he had been told by implication or directly that something in him was insufficient, that the silence was a deficiency rather than simply a different kind of speech. He thought about sitting beside Mabel Baker on a dozen different evenings, and a dozen different stretches of grass or bench or creek bank, and how in every one of those moments the quiet between them had not been empty, but full of the particular richness that comes when two people are comfortable enough with each other not to need noise to prove they're there. He had given up on ever finding someone who understood the silence. He had decided, quietly and without great drama, that it was simply not in the cards for him. And she had sat beside him without speaking, again and again, and he had gradually understood that she was not tolerating the silence but living in it with him, that it was as natural to her as it was to him, that she had been looking for exactly this without knowing what to call it. He asked Mrs. Hargrove if he could speak to her husband the following week. Theodore Hargrove was not Mabel's father. She had no family in Kansas, but he was the closest thing to a community elder who might appropriately be consulted, and Peter was a man who observed certain forms not out of rigid tradition, but out of genuine respect for the sense of rightness in them. Mr. Hargrove listened to what Peter said, nodded slowly, and said he thought Miss Baker was a fine woman and Peter was a good man, and the rest of it was nobody's business but theirs. He had saved money. He was not a rich man, and he had never expected to be one, but 4 years of steady work at the Hargrove Ranch had given him enough for a ring, a modest ring with a small garnet that he found at the jeweler's in Wichita on a trip he took one afternoon in November, telling no one where he was going and why. He asked her on a Sunday in December, on the ridge east of town where they had ridden together in September, where the grass was dead and brown now, and the sky was deep winter blue, and their breath made clouds, and the horses stood patient in the cold. He got down from his horse, and she looked at him with slight confusion, and he went to her side and held up the ring and said, "Mabel Baker, would you do me the considerable honor of becoming my wife?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Her eyes went bright in a way he had learned was what emotion looked like in her when she did not suppress it entirely. "Yes," she said. "Peter Sutton, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it for a moment in the winter light, and then she looked at him, and there was nothing composed about her expression now. It was open and full and entirely present, and he cupped her face in his hands the way he had done on the evening of the bench, and kissed her in the cold December air while the horses stood patiently by, and the grass rustled its dry winter sound, and the entire enormous sky witnessed it without comment. They were married in February of 1875 in the Caldwell church, with Mrs. Hargrove presiding over the preparations with characteristic authority, and the children from Mabel's school seated in the front rows looking collectively pleased in the way children are pleased when something they have been speculating about finally occurs. Hector was Peter's best man and made a speech that was 3 sentences long and deeply felt, which was precisely right. Mabel wore a dress of dark blue wool, not white, which was impractical, and she was a practical woman with her hair pinned up, and a small spray of dried prairie phlox that Peter had found pressed between pages of a book, and had saved without knowing he was saving it for this. She walked down the aisle of that simple church on no one's arm because she had told Mrs. Hargrove she was perfectly capable of walking into her own marriage under her own power, which was a statement so characteristic of her that everyone who heard it had simply accepted it without argument. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice, looking directly at Peter as she said them, and he said his in the quiet, unhurried way he said everything important, and the minister pronounced them man and wife, and the school children made such collective noise of celebration that the horses tied outside startled at their posts. He had been offered, in January of that year, a job as foreman at the Hargrove Ranch, replacing Hector, who was planning to retire at the end of spring. It came with a small house, a real house, not a bunkhouse room on the ranch property, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch that faced west, and it was to this house that he brought his wife on a February evening after the wedding supper, through the cold, clean air and the first snow of the season that had started falling around dusk. She stood in the doorway and looked at the small house with the lamp burning in the window that Mrs. Hargrove had arranged to be lit before their arrival, and she said, "It's ours. It's ours," he agreed. She crossed the threshold with the same decisiveness she brought to everything, set down the bag she was carrying, and looked around at the room, modest and plain and clean, with the expression of someone taking inventory of a thing they intend to make the most of. Then she turned and looked at him standing in the doorway, and she said, "Come in out of the cold, Peter." He came in. He pulled the door closed behind him. The snow fell outside, and the lamp burned warm, and everything that had led to this moment. All the years of quiet and loneliness, and the long patient work of finding himself, had been worth it in the specific way that only arrivals make the journey make sense. Spring came late in 1875, but it came with particular abundance, the grass coming up thick and green, and the creek running high with the snowmelt, wildflowers appearing along the fence lines, and in the low spots where the water stood. Mabel had planted a kitchen garden behind the house and spent her Saturday mornings in it with the focused happiness of a woman doing exactly what she wishes to be doing. She had continued teaching, the school board, after some initial grumbling about the propriety of a married woman continuing to teach, had been persuaded by Mrs. Hargrove and by the fact that Mabel was irreplaceable on any terms that suited them to produce a replacement, and she went into town 3 days a week and taught her students with the same passionate, quiet competence she had brought to it from the beginning. Peter had taken to the foremanship naturally, which did not surprise anyone who knew him. He was good with the men because he was fair, and because he gave clear instructions and did not talk more than necessary, which cowboys on the whole appreciated. He was good with the cattle because he had always had an instinctive understanding of herd behavior, the way that mass of animals thought and moved and could be read. He was good with the logistics because he was meticulous in the particular way of people who have learned through experience what the cost of overlooking small things can be. In the evenings he came home to Mabel, and they cooked supper together and sat on the west-facing porch and watched the light leave the sky. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both states were as good as the other. She had brought her books, and they read in the evenings by lamplight. She her novels and her natural history volumes, he a mixture of practical agriculture texts, and the poetry collection that had lived in his box for 10 years and now lived on the shelf above the fireplace where it looked, he thought, considerably more comfortable. She had made the house into something that was genuinely theirs, not imposing her taste on his or subordinating hers to his, but arriving at something that reflected them both, which seemed to Peter an achievement worthy of considerable appreciation. The quilts on the bed were hers, made by her own hands. The cast iron pans were his, accumulated through years of camp cooking. The pressed wildflowers in the frame on the wall were hers. The map of Kansas she had drawn herself, marking the ranch and the town and the trails, was joint property of a marriage that found the same things interesting. In the late summer of 1875, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, as matter-of-factly as she told him most things, watching his face for the reaction. He stood very still for a moment, the kind of still that comes from receiving something so significant that the body needs a moment to take it in. "Are you well?" he asked, because this was the first thing that mattered. "I am very well," she said. "Dr. Hemming says everything is as it should be." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, and she put her hands against his back and held him in return, and he felt something enormous and wordless moving through him. The specific wonder of this, of all the years leading here, of the particular miracle of being a quiet man who had stopped expecting miracles. He pulled back and looked at her face. "Are you happy about it?" "Profoundly," she said, with the small smile that was the contained version of her full one. "Are you?" "I don't have words for how happy I am," he said, which was the truest thing he had said in a long time. "You don't always need them," she reminded him. He laughed quietly and kissed her forehead and her hair, and she pressed her face against his chest, and outside the kitchen window the Kansas summer went blazing on in its enormous, indifferent, magnificent way. The pregnancy was, as Mabel herself put it, thoroughly unremarkable, which was exactly what everyone hoped for. She taught school until November, when she and the school board agreed she would take the rest of the season, and she spent the winter months in the house reading and sewing, and maintaining the correspondence she had developed with a network of women teachers across Kansas, a project she had undertaken as a way of sharing curriculum ideas and advocating for better resources and pay, which was still substantially inadequate in most districts. Peter fussed about her more than she required and was told so with affection. He made sure the woodbox was always full. He got up at night to add coal to the stove. He drove her to every appointment with Dr. Hemming with a regularity that the doctor found both admirable and slightly excessive. Mabel bore all of this with patient good humor and occasional pointed commentary. "I am expecting a baby," she told him one evening when he had restoked the fire for the third time, "not made of glass." "I know that," he said. "Then stop treating the stove like it requires your personal supervision. I just want you to be comfortable." "I am comfortable. I would be more comfortable if you sat down." He sat down. She handed him his book and picked up her own, and they read together in the firelight, and he reached over after a few minutes and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and that was sufficient for both of them. Their son was born in March of 1876 in the house, with the help of Dr. Hemming and Mrs. Hargrove, who had appointed herself to this role without being asked and was not to be deterred. The birth was long and hard, and Peter spent most of it sitting on the porch in the cold night air because Mrs. Hargrove had expelled him from the bedroom with the brisk authority of a general managing a campaign, and he sat under the stars with his hands on his knees and thought about the entire impossible accumulation of events that had brought him to this porch on this night. And he made promises to the dark and the stars, and whatever it was that ordered the world that he intended to keep. The baby was announced to him by Mrs. Hargrove opening the bedroom door with the expression of a woman who has accomplished something significant and wants this acknowledged. "A boy," she said. "Healthy. Mabel is well." He went in. Mabel was propped against the pillows, tired in the deep specific way of a woman who has done the hardest kind of work, and she was holding the baby in the crook of her arm with the careful concentration of someone holding a thing that is entirely new to them. She looked up when he came in, and her eyes were tired and bright and absolutely present, and she said, "Come see." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, the red wrinkled face, the impossibly small hands, the fierce and specific aliveness of this brand new person, and he was entirely unable to speak, which was fine, because Mabel understood him well enough to know that his silence was not empty. They named him James, after Peter's father. James Sutton was, from the beginning, a loud and vigorous child who seemed to have inherited none of his father's quietness and all of his mother's directness, applied with the uninhibited energy of a person who has not yet learned that the world sometimes prefers you to be less yourself. He had Mabel's gray eyes and Peter's dark hair, and opinions about everything from a very early age, which his parents found both exhausting and deeply satisfying. By the time James was a year old, Mabel had returned to teaching, having made arrangements with Mrs. Cooper across the road to watch the baby on her teaching days, an arrangement that suited everyone. She had been working, in her correspondence with other teachers, on a proposal for the state school board arguing for improved standards in rural school funding. The proposal was well-researched and cogently argued, and was, in the end, taken seriously enough by the board to result in a small but not insignificant increase in per-pupil funding for rural districts the following year, a victory she received with the understated satisfaction of a person who had expected it to work, and is not surprised when the reasonable thing occurs. Peter read the proposal before she sent it, and told her it was the best-argued document he had read in years. She told him his bar might be low given that he mostly read agricultural manuals. He told her she was probably right. They were both smiling. In the years that followed, life at the Sutton house on the Hargrove Ranch took on the shape of something that required no justification or performance. It was simply, entirely itself. Good years and hard years, dry summers and wet ones, the ordinary complications of raising a child and running a ranch and teaching school in a small Kansas town where everyone knew each other's business and had opinions about it. In the spring of 1878, Mabel told Peter she was expecting again. He received this news with a warmth that was by now entirely comfortable in its expression. He pulled her close and said, "Good," against her hair, and she laughed the full laugh she saved for moments between them. This pregnancy was different from the first harder in the early months, and Dr. Hemming was more cautious in his monitoring, and there were 2 weeks in July when Peter sat up too many nights and worried in the quiet way that was worse than any loudness, because it had nowhere to go. But Mabel was stronger than she looked, which he had always known, and the autumn brought her steadily back to herself. And in November of 1878 their daughter was born, small and fierce and vocal in a way that suggested she had opinions already. They named her Clara because Peter asked if Mabel would mind the name, explaining briefly about the woman he had once been engaged to in Wichita, and Mabel had said without any trace of complication, "I think it's a fine name. Let's give it a better history." Clara Sutton was, from the first days, the kind of child who seemed to have been made of sheer determination, and something that occasionally tried the patience of everyone around her, which both her parents privately admired while maintaining the appropriate parental expressions of concern. She walked early, talked early, and by the time she was 2 was following her brother James around the yard with absolute confidence in her right to participate in whatever he was doing. James, for his part, was a remarkably patient older brother, probably because he had inherited, after all, some of his father's steadiness underneath the noise. He would sit with Clara on the porch step and show her things: beetles, stones, the shapes of clouds, with the earnest instruction of a boy who had been raised to believe that showing people things they had not seen before was an act of generosity. Peter watched his children from the porch on summer evenings with his coffee cooling in his hand, and felt something so complete and quiet and real that he had no name for it, and did not need one. He talked to Hector, sometimes Hector who had retired but still came around the ranch most days, because he could no more stay away from a working ranch than he could stop breathing. And they would sit on the porch in the old companionable quiet and watch the grass move. And occasionally one of them would say something, and the other would respond, and it was very much the way things had always been between them. Except that now there was a woman who came out of the kitchen and set a fresh cup of coffee in front of the old foreman and asked after his rheumatics with genuine interest, and Hector had told Peter more than once that he was the luckiest man he had ever met. Peter did not disagree. In the fall of 1879, something happened that brought the larger world pressing against the edges of their life in a way that demanded attention. A group of Northern Cheyenne people had fled from their reservation in Indian Territory the previous autumn, desperate and starving, trying to make their way back to their homelands in the north. The army had pursued them through Kansas and Nebraska, and the whole terrible story had played out in the newspapers and in the conversations of the towns through the winter. The capture, the imprisonment at Fort Robinson, the breakout in January, the deaths. It was the kind of story that the newspapers covered with a combination of drama and a particular blindness to the injustice at its foundation, the kind of blindness that came from never having questioned who the country's laws were written for and who they had never been intended to protect. Mabel had followed the story in the papers and had written about it in a letter to the editor of the Caldwell paper, a careful, clear-eyed letter that acknowledged the violence of the breakout, while naming the desperation that had caused it, that pointed out the discrepancy between the grand language of American liberty and the specific reality of people imprisoned and starving for the crime of wanting to go home. The letter ran, to the paper's modest credit, and generated the kind of mixed response that honest commentary tends to generate: some agreement, much uncomfortable pushback, and a great deal of not reading it and pretending it wasn't there. Peter had read the letter before she sent it. He had read it twice. He had said, "This is right, send it." "Some people will be angry," she said. "Some people are wrong," he said simply. She sent it. The conversation in Caldwell about the letter was exactly what they had anticipated, and Mrs. Hargrove, who agreed with every word but had the pragmatism of a woman managing a town's social fabric, suggested that Mabel might want to let the dust settle before her next public statement. Mabel agreed in the measured way that meant she was filing the opinion away, and would act on her own assessment of the situation in her own time. In the meantime, life continued with the practical demands of a ranch and a school and 2 growing children, and the particular deep pleasure of being known fully by the person you love. By 1880, Peter Sutton was 38 years old. He had been foreman of the Hargrove Ranch for 5 years and had built a reputation across the county as a man of complete reliability. Not exciting, not dramatic, but the kind of man you called when you needed something done right and didn't care how long it took or how quiet the doing was. He had expanded the ranch's cattle operation by 20% by opening a new pasture section to the north. He had negotiated 3 years' worth of favorable contracts with the Wichita buyers. He had hired and kept good men, which is the hardest thing a foreman does, and the ones who had been on the ranch longest would have told you if you asked that working for Sutton was the best job they'd ever had, and if you asked why they would have said, "He tells you what he needs, he leaves you to do it, and he notices when you do it right." Mabel was 34. She had been teaching in Caldwell for 6 years, and was by this point regarded as something between a local institution and a civic treasure, which she bore with the composure of a woman who is internally amused by the distance between what people valued publicly and what they actually meant. She had taught over 200 children and could tell you something specific and true about each one of them. She had Della Connor, now 20, managing the accounts at her family's spread and doing it better than anyone in her family ever had. She had 3 former students at the new state university in Lawrence. She had a second letter to the editor running in November about the school funding issue, this one co-signed by 12 other teachers across 3 counties. She was still teaching the older girls practical mathematics on 2 afternoons a week. She had added this fall a reading circle for the mothers of younger students on Friday evenings, which was nominally about literacy, but was in practice also about community and conversation, and the particular hunger of women in isolated ranch homesteads for something that was theirs. Peter drove her into town on Friday evenings and picked her up, and on the way home she would tell him about the evening, who had come, what they had read, what someone had said that was surprising or funny or unexpectedly profound. And he listened with his full attention and asked the occasional question, and she appreciated his attention more than she could have explained to anyone who had not experienced what real attention versus the performed variety actually felt like. James was 4 years old and Clara was 2, and the house was full of the noise they made and the particular beauty of watching 2 small people discover the world with the urgency and confidence of children who have been loved consistently enough to believe the world will continue to be interesting. In December of that year, near Christmas, there was a cold snap that came down from the north with the sudden ferocity that the plains produced, temperatures dropping to 15 below in 2 days, the creek freezing solid, a wind that cut through everything. The cattle needed extra management, and Peter was out in it for 3 days almost without stopping, coming in at night chilled to the bone and exhausted, and Mabel would have hot water ready and food and the fire built up, and she did not make a fuss about it because she understood the work and its demands. but she also did not let him ignore the fact that he was a person who needed warmth and food and rest. And she sat with him at the table while he ate, and she talked quietly about the children and the school and the things she had read that day, and the warmth came back into him by degrees. On the third night of the cold snap, after the cattle were sorted and the ranch hands settled and James and Clara asleep, Peter came in and found Mabel on the porch in the dark, wrapped in her wool coat, looking at the sky. He stopped beside her. The cold was ferocious, and the sky was enormous and absolutely clear, every star sharp as cut glass in the frozen air, the Milky Way a river of light running south to north above them. It was genuinely breathtaking in the way that terrible beauty is breathtaking. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "I know it's cold," she said, not moving. "Look at that." He looked. He looked for a long time. "When I was small," she said, "there was an old man in Marietta who kept a telescope. He used to let the children look through it on clear nights. I used to think," she paused, and he waited. "I used to think that the sky was trying to tell you something if you could only stand still long enough to hear it." "What does it say tonight?" he asked. She considered. "That we are very small," she said, "and that this is not a cause for despair." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together on the porch under the frozen winter sky, two small warm things in the enormous cold dark, and he thought about all the silences they had shared. The one on this same porch when it was summer, the one on the creek in May, the one on the ridge where the grass moved in September wind, and he thought that this was what he had been made for, not in spite of his quietness but because of it. This specific kind of being present, this specific kind of shared attention, this specific kind of love that did not need constant words to know itself. They went inside eventually. The fire was low and he rebuilt it and she made tea, and they sat on either side of the fire with their cups and the lamp turned low, and it was entirely quiet in the particular full way of their particular quiet. And outside the stars burned cold and clear, and the prairie stretched away in every direction, and the world was dark and good and entirely sufficient. Spring came again in 1881 as it always did, indifferent to the winter that preceded it, with the crocus shoots and the mud and the smell of warming earth that Peter had loved since boyhood. The cattle were in good shape after the cold winter. James, at 5, was old enough to be taken out to the horse paddock and shown things, which he received with the intense focused attention of a child who has been raised to believe that paying attention is an act of respect. Clara, at 3, had decided that she also was old enough for the horse paddock and was not interested in anyone's opinion to the contrary. It was Mabel who suggested that Clara could sit in front of her on the saddle on gentle walks around the yard, which was something Peter would not have proposed on his own, because he was cautious about the children and horses, a caution he recognized as the anxious love of a parent who has imagined too many things going wrong. Mabel's judgment in this, as in most things, proved correct. Clara sat on the saddle with the total fearlessness of a 3-year-old who has never been given reason to doubt the world, and was extremely pleased with herself, and the horse was patient and steady, and nothing went wrong. Peter stood in the yard watching his wife carry his daughter on horseback in the spring sunshine, and felt the specific fullness he had come to associate with moments he wanted to hold still and keep. They had one more child. Peter had not expected it, had thought, in the casual way one thinks about such things, that 2 was their number, complete, and then Mabel came to him in the summer of 1882 with the matter-of-fact expression she used for significant announcements and told him there would be a 3rd in the spring, and he sat with that for a moment and then he said, "Is that good news?" "I believe so," she said with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth. "Then yes," he said, "it absolutely is." Their second son was born in April of 1883, a month that was mild and green and full of the sounds of new things beginning. They named him Edward for no particular ancestor but because it suited him. He was a tranquil baby, dark-eyed and observant, who lay in his cradle watching the room with an air of calm assessment that Mabel said, when he was 3 weeks old, reminded her of his father. Peter held his youngest son in the evenings on the porch, the baby asleep against his chest, and watched the light change over the western grass, and the feeling was so large and so complete that he simply sat inside it, the way you sit inside a landscape you love, taking it in through your whole body rather than just your eyes. James, at 7, was already riding out with Peter on the easier ranch work, an arrangement both father and son were extremely pleased about. Clara, at 5, had decided that she intended to learn everything her brother was learning at the same time, a position her teacher mother found entirely reasonable, and her father found both challenging and secretly wonderful. Edward grew steadily and quietly from a tranquil baby into a placid, curious toddler who followed his father around the house with the focused devotion of a small person who has identified his primary point of reference in the world. In the evenings that fall, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the lamp was low, Peter and Mabel sat on either side of the fire as they had always sat, and sometimes they talked about the children and the school and the ranch and the state of the country and the things she had read and the things he had observed that day. And sometimes they were simply quiet in the way they had always been quiet, and both states were as valuable as the other and always had been. One evening in November, with the first hard frost outside and the fire warm and the house entirely still around them, Mabel set down her book and said, "Do you remember the first evening on the bench outside the general store?" "Which one?" he said. "We had several of those." "The very first one," she said, "when Mrs. Hargrove brought you over to introduce us." "Yes," he said. "I thought," she said, looking at the fire rather than him, "that I had been watching men make conversation my whole life. Performing it is more what I mean, filling space with noise to show they were there, and that you were the only person I had met in a very long time who did not seem to feel the need to prove he was present by being loud." She paused. "I thought it was the most interesting thing I had seen in years. I thought you were the most composed person I had ever met," he said. "And that there was a great deal under the composure worth knowing." "Was there? More than I expected," he said, which was entirely honest. "More every year." She looked at him then, across the fire, with the clear gray eyes that had not changed since the first evening in the church social hall, when he had found her standing apart from the crowd looking toward the window, and he thought as he had thought on the ridge in September of 1874, the first time the thought had fully formed, that this woman was the most interesting person he had ever encountered, and that the interest had not decreased with familiarity, had in fact increased in the specific way that genuine depth rewards sustained attention. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I spent a great many years," she said carefully, "being afraid that my quietness was a flaw, that it was unsociable or strange or insufficient. People made me feel that, people back in Ohio especially." She looked back at the fire. "And then I came here and I met you, and I understood slowly over many evenings on a bench in a dusty Kansas town that the quiet was not a flaw, that it was the shape of how I pay attention. And that there was another person who paid attention the same way, and that it was possible to be known through it rather than in spite of it." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. "I thought the same thing," he said, "more or less exactly the same thing." She looked at him again. The smile came, the full one, and it was still after 9 years together the most transformative thing he had ever seen happen to a face. "Good," she said. "I thought we probably had." He got up from his chair and crossed to hers, and she moved over on it. It was a wide chair, which had always seemed practical to him and now seemed practically perfect. And he sat beside her and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her and they were quiet together while the fire burned and the frost pressed white at the window glass, and the children slept their deep children's sleep, and the ranch was still, and the world was good. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and cold and entirely beautiful, the stars hard and bright above the flat dark land, the grass bent under the frost, the creek frozen, the coyotes somewhere to the south singing their unself-conscious song to nothing in particular. The same sky under which Peter Sutton had ridden for years in quiet solitude, telling himself it was enough, before he had learned what enough actually felt like. It felt like this. It had always been going to feel like this. He simply had not known it yet. James would grow up to be a rancher like his father, with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and would take over the management of the Hargrove Ranch when Peter finally stepped back from the foremanship in his mid-50s, healthy and unhurried, and ready for the kind of mornings he had been promising himself for years. Clara would become a teacher like her mother, would fight every year of her education for the right to be taken as seriously as her brother, and would be taken seriously eventually, and would go on to run the largest school in Sumner County, with the focused authority of a woman who learned the word competence from a woman who lived it. Edward would become, astonishingly, a doctor drawn to the work by a combination of the quiet attention he had inherited from his father and the practical intelligence he had from his mother, and would practice medicine in Caldwell for 40 years, which would mean that the Sutton name was woven into that town in 3 separate and significant ways. But all of that was the future, and the future could take care of itself. Right now, in this chair, in front of this fire, there was only the present, the warmth of it, the simplicity of it, the specific irreplaceable miracle of being completely known and completely loved, and completely at rest in the knowledge of both. Peter Sutton, who had given up on finding this, sat beside Mabel Baker, who had sat beside him without speaking on a bench in the last light of a September evening, and changed everything simply by understanding the silence for what it actually was, and he held her close and she held him back, and the fire burned warm and the night was cold, and the world outside was vast and wild and beautiful and entirely, permanently theirs.